Uh, Good morning. My name's Craig Kennedy. I'm a senior fellow at American Purpose, and I want to welcome you to today's discussion on the revitalization of the Transatlantic Partnership. We're doing this in partnership with the U.S. Europe Alliance. Most of you are regulars in our events or know the general approach. We're going to do 30 minutes of discussion with the two distinguished panelists that we have today, and then we'll go to Q&A. For Q&A, either raise your hand using the little thing down in reactions like that, or send us a note in chat and we will recognize you. So before I turn it over to Richard Kraemer, who's the head of the U.S. Europe Alliance, just a few words to set the stage. The recalibration of the Transatlantic Partnership is one of those hardy perennials in debate around Washington, but it might be especially important right now. We've had controversies over submarines. We've had controversies over burden sharing. In Europe, you have talk of strategic autonomy to have a more defined European versus transatlantic approach to security. And in the United States, you have a dramatic shift towards Asia and maybe a certain amount of apathy towards Europe. So there's a lot to talk about today. Looking forward to a very, very robust discussion. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Richard Kraemer to introduce our panelists and go from there.
Good morning to the audience and Craig. Thank you very much. Michelle, thank you as well. This is great to be engaging in this event with American Purpose. I'd like to thank our speakers, Tom and Constanze. I'll introduce them in a moment. But first, my name is Richard Kraemer, and I'm the board president of the U.S. Europe Alliance. The U.S. Europe Alliance is a 501c4, currently transitioning to 501c3, nonpartisan, non-governmental organization, or bipartisan rather. And our mission is to mobilize Americans to advocate for the enduring U.S. Europe Alliance. And we have been in existence now for 2.5 years. And my colleagues at USCA and I argue that what makes us distinct is that we try to get outside of Washington, D.C. and succeed in reaching out to Americans in Virginia, Florida, Michigan, Idaho, of all different kinds of stripes and colors, whether university students, pipe fitters, folks in the energy sector, folks in world affairs councils, representatives of local and state government, and trying to impress upon them the multiple benefits that they derive and their communities derive from a successful and prosperous transatlantic relationship. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, starting with Constanze Stelzenmüller, who is the inaugural holder of the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations at the Center for United States and Europe at Brookings Institution, where she has also served as the inaugural Robert Bosch Senior Fellow. Prior to working at Brookings, Constanze was a senior transatlantic fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where she directed influential Transatlantic Trends survey program. And from 1994 to 2005, she was an editor for the political section of the German weekly Die Zeit, where she also served as defense and international security editor. Ambassador Tom Shannon, who I'm very happy to share, is a member of the board of directors at USEA, is also a senior fellow with the Future of Diplomacy Project and a senior international policy advisor at Arnold and Porter. Most recently, Ambassador Shannon served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs at the State Department. And prior to his 2016 appointment by President Obama as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Ambassador Shannon served as United States Ambassador to Brazil. He has served as Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs and Special Assistant to the President's Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. So, Craig, thank you very much for setting the stage. Indeed, we're looking at now, it's 80 years since the Atlantic Charter was created and signed as kind of a roadmap as to what was going to happen at the end of the Second World War and what kind of transatlantic community was envisioned. And it was one that was certainly based on liberal democratic values, set up institutions accordingly, and as I will fervently argue, has provided a level of security and prosperity, not only within the community, but on a global level that's been unprecedented. Nonetheless, it's been of concern over the past couple decades. Various administrations here in the United States, as well as various Congresses, have given a lot of lip service and responded to our relations across the water with a lot of sort of assumptions that it's a relationship that doesn't need the degree of care and maintenance that it demands, given how important this relationship has been and all that it's accomplished. So, right now, I would posit that most of the folks in this room probably feel, dare I say, the same way that we did about 2.5 years ago when we launched our organization, which is essentially that we have seen European leaders speaking of a Europe that wants to go it alone, and that Europe can no longer rely on the US, and that these kind of sentiments are also, as Craig indicated, have been felt on this side of the Atlantic. Recognizing that we have achieved so much, it's incumbent upon us, as we argue at USEA, to do what we can to cultivate, preserve, and help this relationship go forward in the 21st century with new challenges. So that means we need to reflect on certain relationship fundamentals that I think have been lost. And that's really what we want to do today. So to kind of give you a roadmap to the discussion, we're going to talk about some big picture questions and then kind of come down a little bit into some more contemporary issues that will help us flesh out ways by which we can better cooperate. I would argue that a lot of these relationship fundamentals that have sort of been lost, it strikes me, are common to any kind of relationship. It could be personal, it could be professional, familial, but that basically the essentials of a functioning relationship are those regarding mutual trust and respect, open lines of communication, a committed spirit of cooperation, and most importantly, shared values. And the greater question is, have we lost sight of these basics? And if so, how did that happen? And what can transatlanticists do to help recalibrate this relationship? So turning to the question of relationship fundamentals for our speakers, in the 20th century, the transatlantic community was much smaller, and Europe was, quote unquote, Western primarily, at least in respect to the transatlantic community. It's now a larger and it's a more diverse community. And as a consequence, the potential for disagreement, dispute, it could be dissatisfaction with EU Commission policies in some Central European governments, or Germany and Central Eastern European states diverging Russian threat assessments. These are disputes or differing perspectives at best that lead to discord in Europe, which then impact the Transatlantic Alliance. And meanwhile, here in the United States, we are as a society more divided than I've experienced in my life, having been born in 1972. American post-Iraq and Afghanistan fatigue is palpable. Recent administrations have been inattentive to American relationships with Europe. There's a lack of consensus on the threat that China poses. And then the Biden administration has, in the opinion of several, mismanaged a lot of its foreign policy agenda, whether it's the Afghanistan withdrawal, approaches to Nord Stream 2, and the referenced AUKUS Pact and the intended submarine squabble. So the questions I have for Tom and Constanze to start with is, like, the transatlantic values, concerns, and objectives, were they that much more common or shared in the second half of the 20th century? Or is it that the shifting world order and the newer challenges of the 21st century are rendering the previous ones, common transatlantic concerns and cooperation, distinctly less relevant? And with that, I'll turn to Constanze to lead us off.
Okay. I don't know. I tend to think that we see the past through rosy-tinted glasses and forget just how vicious the disputes were. I'm a foreign service brat, so I was subjected to this stuff, even in childhood. So my memory, unfortunately, goes back farther than is probably compatible with child welfare. And it seems to me that we, I think, I don't think it's particularly, shall we, productive to compare current debates to the past. We are where we are now. I don't want to return to a Europe that consists only of Western Europe. I think that Europe was tremendously enriched by enlargement, and the challenge is to manage it as it is, right? And that the transatlantic relationship is now not just about security and about defending territory, but about trade and technology, and to some degree also about how to preserve our democracies, representative democracies, and to protect the state as a provider of public goods against the onslaught of populists who want to disassemble it. I mean, all that strikes me as to the good. You know, as far as I'm concerned, we're finally focusing on what matters. So I am, I mean, you know, I'm not, which is not to say that I don't find some of this quite scary. I do. I do think that we've been very complacent about, you know, winning the Cold War and about the West, you know, being the better system. I've said stuff like that. I still think that democracy is the better system, but we've got to prove ourselves in ways that we haven't had to before, and that to me is good. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Tom?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Richard. It's a real pleasure to be here, and especially with Constanze, a very remarkable thinker on all things transatlantic. I approach the region a bit differently. I spent the large part of my career in Africa and Latin America and globalized late in life, thanks to President Obama and John Kerry as counselor of the department and then Undersecretary of State, and really came to the transatlantic relationship by working on issues outside of Europe, across the world, where we were working alongside our EU and NATO partners, from Afghanistan to Africa to Asia, and larger areas both of cooperation and contestation. And what struck me across my career, first of all, is the remarkable ability of our transatlantic partners to first of all form consensus within the European Union and also within NATO to deal with a world that was changing dramatically. Because really in the aftermath of the Cold War and the so-called emergence, you know, of a new world order, the world really began to shift in dramatic and profound ways, with one of the most important being the creation and the building of a global economy that permitted a huge flow of wealth from west to east, and the reemergence of giant societies and giant economies in China and India that have fundamentally reshaped how we understand the world strategically. And so getting to your question, I think that at one level, in the immediate aftermath of World War II and during the construction of this transatlantic partnership, there was a clarity of purpose and a clarity of mind, which comes from, first of all, trying to recover from the devastation of a global conflict, but also from dealing with a very determined adversary in the Soviet Union. But that also, as Constanze noted, with time, our transatlantic partnership has expanded dramatically through the expansion of the European Union and the expansion of NATO. And that this has, in many ways, reshaped these institutions within boundaries that appear to be constant over time, but has fundamentally shifted the political dynamic that's taking place inside of these larger organizations or institutions. And this is to the good, because in what is happening is that the transatlantic relationship is responding to a different global environment. But this is where the challenge lies, I believe. It's a political challenge at the end of the day. It's how the United States, with its transatlantic partners, define the global environment and understand where they face adversaries, where they can work together, and how they can cooperate and collaborate. And as Constanze noted, as we turn to the things that are real, for me in the relationship, they have to do with trade and technology, but they also have to do with a global framework for understanding our relationship. In other words, the transatlantic relationship historically has been understood as a North Atlantic relationship. I would argue that in order to be meaningful in a global context, it also has to be understood as a Mediterranean and a South Atlantic relationship, and through the South Atlantic, an Indo-Pacific relationship. And so we have to find a way to kind of expand the geopolitical contours of what it is we're dealing with. But I would also argue that increasingly it needs to be understood in social terms, not just political terms. Although we have a tendency to try to frame the larger geopolitical environment in terms of nation state adversaries, the reality is we're facing challenges like climate change, but that's not the only one, which sit outside of this nation state structure and that have to be addressed in a transnational fashion. And the effort, both at the G20 and now in Glasgow, show the real limitations of our nation state effort to address issues. But what's interesting about the transatlantic relationship, from my point of view, is that our social connectivity built over decades through migration, through political cooperation, and through any number of other historical phenomenon and political and economic mechanisms, has a crispness to it, an electricity to it that is real. And even though there are differences and competing points of view, there's an ability to communicate, which is quite remarkable. And we have to find a way to transform that into political action and use how societies relate to each other to drive and determine how governments relate to each other. And in this regard, I'm actually optimistic and hopeful, because although we face a world in which the relative importance and power of both Western Europe and the United States has declined over time, we still have in our societies a dynamism and innovative capacity to project ourselves far beyond our frontiers and to have an impact on how the world understands itself. And I think in many ways, this is the challenge we face today.
Thank you. Constanze, do you have any response to that or additions?
No, just to say that I unfortunately omitted the courtesies, for which I apologize. I just got some bad news about a friend just as we were started and was distracted briefly. I want to say I'm really grateful for being invited to this discussion. And I really like this expression that Ambassador Shannon just used about the crispness and electricity of relations. That's something I sense too. I mean, I confess, quite pessimistic about some things. I'm distressed about the degree to which we seem to have debased and devalued our democracies. That is of immense concern to me. But and there I would like to see some more crispness and electricity as we deal with these issues. But to be discussed.
Yeah, indeed. So, back to you, Tom. You've had an immense experience working in the U.S. government as a diplomat, as a ranking diplomat, as undersecretary. All kinds of experience here in Washington, D.C. as it relates to Congress as well. And I think it would be helpful. I have conversations with transatlanticists, both on the Hill as well as those that are in government right now. And I'd be, given what you've gone through in your life, I think it'd be useful if you'd be able to share a little bit about some ideas that you may have, or what you would tell to policymakers that are here in the United States that are working to best ensure that these relations flourish.
Well, that's a great question. And I guess I would respond in the following way. First, historically, the United States emerged in the world strategically as a naval power and a trading power, and a power that really operated along the periphery of the Eurasian continent, if you want to call it that, but never really had a foothold in that kind of larger Eurasia until World War I and World War II, when we built a military presence in Western Europe. And if I were a Russian strategic planner or a Chinese strategic planner, my purpose would be to drive the United States out of Western Europe and to break the relationship the fundamental security and political relationship between Western Europe and the United States, because then the United States returns to largely being an island, even connected to Central America and South America, and one that only operates along a periphery in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. And so I would remind, first of all, I would remind our partners in government and in the Congress that our relationship with Western Europe is a vital part of our ability to influence events globally and not to be a spectator or a reactor. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two kind of touches on what Constanze talked about with populism and the concerns about democracy. Because what's happening in the United States is a really profound political transition and transformation as we rebuild our political parties from the ground up and try to construct political institutions and political parties that are more responsive and more representative of the American public. And this is going to be a long and messy process. But part of that process is going to be building a new consensus about American purpose in the world. And I would argue that this is something that can't just be left to Americans. It's too important to the United States, and it's too important to our historic partners, especially our transatlantic partners. And in this regard, I would argue that we really need very close engagement from our transatlantic partners, especially through the European Union and through NATO, to keep reminding us of the uniqueness and the importance of this relationship, how it has shaped a world that largely benefits us, and how if we lose this in some way, if we step away from it, that it will be to our detriment.
Thank you, Tom. Turning to some of the issues then that I think will allow us to sort of like pull out the threads a little bit as to the kind of engagement about which you're speaking and how to best maximize it so that both sides, our European allies, as well as the United States and Canada, are able to best profit from transatlantic relations that are functioning and around which there is consensus, around which there is genuine political commitment. I very much agree. I believe it was you, Tom, that said this is about political will, as is often the case. So turning to probably, I would argue, one of the greatest issues about which there is divergence right now within the community, and that's on the question of China, a rising China, and how it should be approached. So Constanze, right now we're looking at the United States and Europe, key powers, particularly Germany and France, as having a very different kind of threat assessment when it comes to Beijing and its intentions within Europe and also globally. And a response as a consequence, a transatlantic response, has so far continued to be elusive. And I'm curious as what would have to happen to potentially catalyze a common approach within the transatlantic community that would be proportionate to the dangers that Xi Jinping's Communist Party right now poses for democracies around the world and for the world order as we've known it?
Thank you. That's a really big question that we could spend the entire session on. And I'm really not in a position to speak to the French-China debate. I would prefer to leave that to others. But it seems to me that it is more germane, sorry, no pun intended, to talk about Germany here, because of Germany's enormous weight in the trade with China, and because really Germany's relations with China dwarf those of other European Union members. So what Germany does matters. And I think actually, with all due respect, the debate in Germany has moved quite significantly. And it's moved to an extent that you could say that Merkel's position is an outlier. Merkel's position of careful balancing of America against China is an outlier even in her own party. And as is so often the case, including with Russia, we have, you can usually rely on the Kremlin and on Beijing to clarify their own intentions in such a way as to firm up resolve on the other side. I think that's currently happening with that's what's been happening with Russia since 2008. I would argue in Europe. It's certainly happening currently with energy, gas supply shortages and price spikes, and current troop movements along the eastern border of Ukraine. But the Chinese have been doing similar things with their wolf warrior diplomacy in Europe, with their bullying of Taiwan, with the repeated massive air incursions over Taiwan, and their crackdown on civil liberties and social safety, really, in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang. You've had a German Federation of Industry paper in 2019, which adopted the European Union language of partner, competitor, rival. You have Social Democratic Party papers in Germany that criticize the cautiousness of the Merkel government's position on Huawei, and also sort of describe China as a rival, and in ways that I think were received here with some gratitude. So I think on the whole, things have really moved there, and I think that the next German government, and it's pretty clear what the composition of it is going to be, simply because they have no alternative. It's going to be a traffic light government led by Olaf Scholz. And I'm fairly certain that its position on China will, or at least that they will try to more sharply delineate. There will still no doubt be room for disagreement between Washington and Berlin. It will be difficult to find a cohesive position within Europe because of the inroads that the Chinese have made very carefully and very strategically by buying critical infrastructure in Europe, particularly along the southern and southeastern periphery, and in the Western Balkans. But there is great concern about all this. And I think the next German government will pay a lot more attention to investment screening, to infrastructure ownership, to supply chain resilience and redundance, and that kind of thing. I'm less concerned there. What it seems to me, though, that the position in Washington, both within this administration and among Democrats and between Democrats and Republicans, isn't as clear-cut as it is sometimes described. There is significant debate here about the wisdom of about the wisdom of confrontation and the possibility of genuinely mitigating American economic interdependence with China. And I think it's useful to not gloss over that.
No, agreed and understood. It still is indeed still a topic of debate. Certainly more heated before the Biden administration came in, and the question as to whether or not there would continue to be a more competitive, if not adversarial, stance vis-a-vis Beijing. And thus far, it appears to be that, but it's still early on. I'm curious. Constanze, you mentioned that there has been a shift, and I'm curious how there's the wolf warrior diplomacy, there's the aggressive financing and investment of critical infrastructure, which has raised alarms. But I'm curious, how much of this do you think is a concern for human rights, at least within Germany? That between Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, has this been driving a bit of the shift that you identified? And I think it's particularly important because in reflecting in my own experience, my own political maturity coming about in the 1980s, remembering just how deplorable the situation was in South Africa, and eventually it just became untenable for the likes of Barclays and others to be able to continue to engage with the government there and in the markets there. And I wonder to the extent, granted, the interdependence is completely different, but there's still, I feel like, a lesson learned there about the extent to which, certainly within the transatlantic community, and speaking again to shared values, that there are individual fundamental rights that are inviolable, and to the extent that China continues to disregard those, even if it's within its own borders, could eventually make it difficult for political and business leaders that want to do business with China to continue to do so.
Yes. Well, you were alluding, among other things, or perhaps too polite to say, that the German car manufacturer Volkswagen has a very large plant in Xinjiang, which is by no means the only human rights issue that Germany's trade relationship with China raises, of course. I'm a trained constitutional and human rights lawyer myself. So as far as I'm concerned, you're running, as we say in German, into open doors. I mean, I'm not going to say anything particularly startling when I say that that Germany has talked a good game on multilateralism and human rights, and has, however, often found it expedient to not mention those things as quite stridently when trade relations with China are concerned. And that is not something I am particularly proud of. You will find a lot of German think tankers criticizing that. Remember that Angela Merkel, at the beginning of her 16-year tenure, met with the Dalai Lama very deliberately. And the Chinese threw a hissy fit, the German industry threw a hissy fit. She never met with him again. I don't think that kind of thing should happen. The Chinese shouldn't be able to tell us to do this kind of thing. But based on my sense of where not just policymaker but also public feelings are going in Germany, I think that it is becoming increasingly, the Chinese are increasingly painting themselves into a corner on this point. Unlike during the Cold War, when the likes of actually not me personally, but my generation and older generations of Western Europeans were, organized in amnesty sections and writing letters to prison directors in the Soviet Union. But we actually had very little knowledge of what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, unless information was smuggled out by dissidents. It is very hard today for the Chinese to hide what they're doing and to whom they're doing it and how. And there has been a great deal of very detailed reporting on events in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, and in Taiwan. Our problem is not lack of knowledge. Our problem is indifference. And our problem is, I think, the kind of indifference that comes, or denial, if you will, that comes out of a sense of powerlessness, right? And that's a psychological mechanism that I think Western democracies are feeling with regard to a lot of things, including to the state of affairs in their own countries. But I do sense, again, from my own personal subjective interpretation of the debate in Germany, noting that I haven't been able to travel back since the beginning of the pandemic because of the travel ban. So, this is based on what I read and friends that I talk to, is that there is a very real sense of outrage, not just among policymakers, but in the public about Chinese depredations of their own civil societies and of democratic societies in the neighborhood. And I think that is genuinely damaging Chinese status as a partner and as a presence in Europe. I mean, nobody in Germany talks about strategic partnership with China anymore.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. No, well, from my perspective as being a liberal, small d Democrat, and someone who spent years working in the field of democracy, governance, and human rights, I find that encouraging, and I have been pleased to see the direction that appears to be the German society appears to be taking. Whether or not the private sector will follow, as you indicated, there are some positive signs, but this will be difficult. So with that going, I don't want to get away from China just yet. I want to turn it over to Q&A, and there's so many things that we can talk about. But Tom, I'd be interested to hear, apropos Constanze's acknowledgement that there is still debate here within Washington and more broadly in America about how to respond to China. Do you see that there are these sort of common areas of interest whereby there could be the foundation for a more common approach between the United States and Europe when it comes to China, and how to effectively manage that relationship?
Actually, I think there's a lot of room. I think there might be some tactical differences about how to address the China problem, but I don't think there are strategic differences within the United States. What's striking to me, at least, is how similar the Trump administration, the Biden administration's understanding of China is, and also how homogenous the understanding of China is within the U.S. Congress. If you were to talk to U.S. ambassadorial nominees who were going up to the Hill to meet with members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and staff, they would all tell you that one of the central messages they heard is that our biggest challenge and adversary over the many decades to come will be China. And all of these nominees, no matter where they were going, were asked about how they viewed China and what the United States could or should be doing. In other words, China is going to be seen as a global challenge and a global issue, while at the same time recognizing that, unlike the Soviet Union, that we have an economic relationship, a trade and investment relationship with China that is considerable, and that to the extent that it can be, needs to be protected. Where if there's, I think, a sense of unease or concern, I think it's a growing recognition that the US and European relationship with China is going to depend much more on China than on us. In other words, how China behaves. And the behavior we've seen recently is worrisome, whether it's in Hong Kong, whether it's in Taiwan, whether it's in Xinjiang province, or elsewhere. And there's a recognition now that this broader understanding of political progress in the world needs to be reevaluated. That there is in China a techno-authoritarian model of government that has accomplished much in terms of addressing issues of poverty and national economic and social development and global standing and prestige. But at the same time, this has come with a real cost for some members of larger China and for countries along the periphery and elsewhere. And I think in this regard, this is where politics and diplomacy are going to play an important role, and where the political leadership in the United States and in Europe is going to be tested. Because I believe that if we can keep the peace in the 21st century, we have an opportunity to reap the benefits of extraordinary technological change and social change that is going to fundamentally improve the quality of life for billions of people. But that if we can't keep the peace, if we fall into the kinds of confrontation and competition that we saw in the 20th century, then we're doomed to another bloody century. And that would be regrettable, to say the least. So I think in some ways this depends on our leadership, but it also depends on Chinese leadership.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, I have more questions, of course, about climate, about trade, about the prospects of European Defense Force, but we have about 20 minutes left here. So I want to open it up for Q&A, and we'll see if any of those topics are touched upon. If not, there might be time to return to them. But I'd like to start with a member of the audience who submitted questions yesterday. Please feel free to either submit via chat, as Craig indicated, and I'm going to sort of take on the spirit of Jeff Gedman here and encourage people, if you have a question, also to get yourself on the video and talk to us. But we have this question here from a Mr. Bill Wanland, who sent it in yesterday. He was very, very eager for today's discussion. And Bill is asking us, although the United States is traditionally considered the democratic standard to which other nations aspire, America's commitment to democracy is now being questioned on several fronts, internationally and domestically. Freedom House and other organizations have chronicled a steady decline in American democracy over the past decade or so. Is this a valid concern for our diplomats who promote democracy around the world? And can the US still be a credible democratic role model for other countries? Asking that we, to the extent that either of you want to respond to this, that we keep that response within a European theater.
I'm happy to start.
Thank you.
It's a big question, and I appreciate Bill raising it because it's an important one, as we and our European partners also have a larger discussion about what democracy is. And as we deal with the forces of populism in our own countries and nationalism, and try to preserve the quality of the transatlantic relationship as we work through these transformation and processes. And at one level, I would say that yes, this is an issue that needs to be thought about and worried about, and needs to be in the forefront of our minds, as we have a larger discussion about the world. But at the same time, I think what is remarkable about what we're seeing is that it's showing that democratic processes have an elasticity to them and a flexibility to them that allow them to have this discussion without the whole system breaking apart. And I would argue in this regard that our adversaries or competitors, however you want to define them, have systems which are more brittle and which require repression in order to maintain their solidness or their integrity. The democracies do not. And I think this gives the democracies an advantage, a political advantage over time that authoritarian competitors do not have. But I also think if we get the right kind of leadership, the right kind of engagement from our populations, the right kind of commitment to democracy, you're going to see countries that are able to project themselves into the future in ways that promote stability and prosperity, as opposed to tear things down. And I guess I would close just by saying that, one of the striking things about democracies is that they're very self-critical, and they're very focused on their failings. But when the United States was fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy, or make democracy safe for the world, however you want to phrase it, the reality in the United States is that Americans were being lynched. Jim Crow laws were being put in place. Political intimidation was being used, not only against minority populations, but against political outliers. In other words, all of our countries have had these moments in time in which we are promoting bigger visions of ourselves that didn't necessarily correspond to the immediate reality at the time. But we never lost kind of the vision that we were pointed towards, or the ideals that inspired us. And I think if we can keep those front and center and present, then we have a very good chance.
Thank you. I see that we have a question here from Michal Baranovsky of GMF Warsaw, unless Michal has moved on to somewhere else and I wasn't aware of it. It's been a while, Michal. It's good to see you, please.
Good to see you now. I'm hello from still sunny Warsaw, and it's great to see many friends online. I have a quick comment, maybe if I came to the last question and then a question. I mean, the comment is about just the importance of America's position on democracy. And we are talking in quite abstract terms over the last half an hour or so, without mentioning President Trump too much or President Biden too much. And, I can testify from my own country that it mattered what policy US had to my government over the last 4 years. And the conditionality or lack of it when it comes to standards of democracy matters a whole lot. And I would encourage our American colleagues to sort of figure out also what they really want to accomplish also ahead of the Summit for Democracies. The question I had is about, we focus quite quickly in this discussion on China, and of course, as a European sitting on top of it, on the eastern flank of the alliance, I would be just very curious to get your sense, both Constanze's and ambassadors, on debate inside Washington about US as a European power, its commitment, the balance between Europe and China, global posture review, etc., etc. Thanks.
If I may, as the European on the panel, I think Michal, as a former colleague, just like Craig, is making a really, really important point here. And it's one that has been raised by the Europeanists in Washington occasionally, which is that the Biden administration's Europe policy is a lot less sharp-edged than its China and Indo-Pacific policy is. There is something of an intellectual vacuum there that hasn't been filled out yet. And the effect of that vacuum is compounded by the problems with filling out ambassadorial positions and high-level positions at state. The extraordinary time lag that we've seen there. And I think the combination of that vacuum and the lack of or the empty positions, and shall we say perhaps a certain prioritization, at least in terms of NSC staffing, of Asian and Chinese issues over European issues, has, I think, led to the intra-alliance conflicts that we've seen over Afghanistan and over the submarine deal. That combined, I think, with a sense in the Biden administration of a very narrow bandwidth and limited political capital, foreign and security policy, and a general sense of running against the clock. All of which is to say that it seems to me that the really quite promising mood music of the June Biden trip to Europe then sort of petered out, and a lot of time was lost where concrete steps could have been undertaken but weren't, to solidify the relationship and make it more resilient against future shocks, which appear to me to be inevitable. It seems to me, though, that this administration does fundamentally understand that, as Ambassador Shannon was saying, is that the Europeans are no longer just sort of, icing Rosettas on the cake of alliance legitimacy. They aren't just sort of decorative partners for American purposes in the world. They are, in fact, essential. And that European lack of cohesion, European absence at America's side, actually limits American resources to deal with a challenge like China, which is only partially a military one, but in many ways is one that is about, as the economist Henry Farrell put it, weaponizing interdependence. About reshaping the global order to serve Chinese purposes, and there a Europe that is cohesive, and that's a very big if, unfortunately, currently, but a cohesive Europe, a Europe that has a sense of purpose in the world, is an indispensable ally to American purposes. The problem, Michal, of course, you and I know, and you and I have talked about this in the past, is that Europe currently presents a picture of some disarray and some uncertainty. The German elections actually have been more encouraging than I'd thought, But on the foreign and security front, I do have some questions for these three negotiating partners. But we're looking at a Polish government that is openly challenging the rule of law in Europe and the principle of the independence of national judiciaries, where it seems to me seeing a British government that still is mostly about performative politics and it is genuinely struggling with the economic implications and aftermath of Brexit, and a French government that is struggling to maintain course against challenge from really quite vicious populists like Marine Le Pen and now more recently Eric Zemmour, who I think challenges the fundamentals of the French constitutional order and France's role in the European Union. And if we can't as Europeans, come, and I've left aside Hungary and other issues, but if we can't as Europeans deal with these problems on our own, I think there is little, we have little credibility moaning about the behavior of our partners or about the behavior of America. But perhaps Ambassador Shannon would like to weigh in on that as well.
Ambassador Shannon, Tom?
Well, I think Constanze said it well, and I'm not sure I have much to add at this point, except to once again highlight that the Trump administration approach to Europe, the support for Brexit, the teardown or the beginning of the teardown of a relationship with the European Union was a gift to our adversaries. And the Biden administration, I think, has worked to repair this. It's not easy, given the volatility of politics in the United States and the concern that we might not be as reliable a partner as we once were, at least in terms of our purpose in the world. But I think what President Biden and his team are trying to do is underscore that this is a relationship, the transatlantic relationship, that still is fundamental to our prosperity, fundamental to our security, and fundamental to how we understand ourselves, and that we cannot step away from it without risking not just our well-being, but our understanding of who we are. And this is going to be part of a larger debate as we get deeper into this administration, as we head to midterm elections in the United States and then to presidential elections in 3 years' time. And this is where our European partners can play a role, because as I mentioned earlier, this can't just be a discussion about ourselves. It has to be, in this sense of partnership, involve these partners in some way and have them remind us of the importance of the relationship to our common well-being and purpose.
Thank you. Dr. Raymond Davies, if you'd please introduce yourself and pose the question.
Yes, so Dr. Raymond Davies, I'm chair of British American Business Connections, which is part of the BIBN network. I would just want to follow on from Constanze's illustration. I think with the submarine deal and the relationship between the two nuclear powers, which is UK and France, which is now resulting in a deterioration of both diplomatic and trade relations with France, and also how America sees handling that, particularly with Britain now looking to work much more closely in trade terms through the free trade agreements with the democracies within the Commonwealth, from Canada, obviously, to Australia, from the submarine deal is an example of that. And just as importantly, the largest democracy being India. I'd love to hear views on that.
Whoever wishes to respond first, please.
I can take a stab. First of all, thank you for the comment and the question. The striking thing about the Australia, UK, US deal is, first of all, strategically, that it drew Australia into a militarily adversarial relationship with China. And so Australia is making a big bet, one that could pay high dividends because nuclear submarines are remarkable craft, not just in terms of their capability, but in terms of the broader structures that are required. And if you look at that agreement, what's striking about it is that Australia has been pretty much promised to be part of a larger scientific, technological, and defense industry infrastructure that could be very beneficial to it and make it a center for advanced technologies and sensitive technologies in a way that would be very interesting for Australia, and a larger kind of US-driven strategic technological partnership in the Indo-Pacific region. Bringing the UK along, of course, was necessary because of the UK's attachment to nuclear technology and to our nuclear submarine program. However, in my view, excluding the French was a diplomatic blunder of remarkable proportion. And I really don't understand how it happened because France has interests in the South Pacific, and which means that the European Union has interests in the South Pacific. And it struck me that bringing France along in some fashion was important. And in the aftermath of this, French outrage was white hot, and it was authentic and it was real. It wasn't just Gallic kind of invention or hyperbole. And unfortunately, the US response was to say, well, the French will get over this, as if it were just like a digestive problem. I don't think they're going to get over it. In fact, I think it has fundamentally shifted how they view the United States and how they understand US commitment to Europe. And I think the Americans, the Biden administration has a lot of work to do here in convincing people that we have not kind of turned away from European security concerns and have not turned away from European partners that have been important to us over time.
All right, Constanze, if you don't have anything to add, maybe we can try to get in just one quick question from Ms. Livia Franco. If you would please, concise, I would appreciate it a great deal.
Okay, so I'm Livia Franco and I'm Portuguese. I'm a Portuguese scholar. At the moment, I'm a visiting professor here at Georgetown in DC. My question is very simple. We've been talking mainly about governments and their policies. And I'm wondering about voters and public opinion. As a European, I'm seeing that the majority of polls are showing that the public opinion in Europe is not very inclined to be involved in this competition between the US and China, and the majority of them want to remain neutral. I don't know if that's possible, but they want to remain neutral in this competition between the two major powers. I would like to hear the speakers on this, because the majority of the governments in transatlantic allies are democracies. So the public opinion is very important when thinking about their foreign policies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, perhaps I can take a stab at that. The desire for neutrality is directly correlated with the sense of powerlessness that I mentioned before. There is a psychological connection to that, and it's not even entirely irrational, hence the importance of safety in numbers and safety in a cohesive European Union position. And as I said, for that, Germany is central. And I do think that the German position is changing. The problem is that the Chinese have invested very shrewdly in the smaller, peripheral, more vulnerable EU members for whom the stakes are different than for Germany. I mean, we Germans sort of like to say we need to balance out because we're vulnerable. Actually, our smaller neighbors are much more vulnerable than we are. And so if there is a sort of shift in Germany on this position, but if we want to produce European cohesion, actually, the challenge for Germany is not so much articulating its own position, but making sure that the fears and the vulnerabilities of the smaller peripheral European neighbors are addressed. And that will require reassurances from Germany, and presumably not just reassurances. That's the problem here. And it's obviously, there's the reason why the Chinese have proceeded as they have. On the other hand, I think that, it also has to be said, it was a matter of ideological conviction a decade ago that one should sell one's municipal corporations to Indonesia or one's ports to China. In fact, we were telling the Greeks to sell national infrastructure assets to China or elsewhere, right? And we have since, I think, been forced to reflect on the wisdom of that advice. But since we were the ones providing that advice, it seems to me that we also have some responsibility in helping to mitigate its impacts.
Well said, vis-a-vis Montenegro as well as another example.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much. I know we're 1 minute over, so I'd like to thank Ambassador Shannon and Tom and Constanze. Thank you so much for your insights today and your perspectives on this. It's been rich, it's been substantive. I took a lot of notes, and judging from all the folks that joined us today and stayed on throughout the event, you've been heard. And I'm glad that we could give you the forum together with American Purpose for that very reason. Craig, I turn it back over to you.
So a big thank you to our panelists. It was a really enlightening discussion. Many thanks to our audience. And we hope to do more with the U.S. Europe Alliance and you, Rich. So take care, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Pleasure.
Thank you for
Bye,
attending, everyone.
Thanks
Good
for
day.
tuning in. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.